his teacher had inherited, I suppose, the organization from his own father. His father had written a book. Then Hussein's teacher had written a few books and some poetry. His teacher had lost his daughter in a car accident. And from what little Hussein shared, that devastated him, and he became a recluse for the most part. When you have a huge organization that the way that they did, you're working with 300, 400, 500 people. It's very different when you're working with a lot of people. And by working, he had a huge backyard with lots of trees, and so he would have them clean the trees, just manual work, physical work. They would eat together in a very quiet way, but it wasn't really a one-to-one sort of a thing, as far as I know. When Hussein came here, because of him, only to realize that his teacher had passed and he was lied to by the sun, he moved from Natomas to Sacramento. And we're talking about the 1980s, the Persian community is very small. And Hussein did not have the sort of personality that would, it wasn't very inviting. You know, he would just kind of look at someone and say, "You're an idiot." And not very many people would enjoy, those kind of remarks. And so the only three who were stuck with him, me, Mehrdad, and Hussein. He dealt with three very, very uneducated people, in the sense that I wasn't very familiar with the Quran, and I hadn't read Rumi or Sa'di, just basic stuff that we learned in school. And so when he would speak, I wouldn't have a reference point. I didn't know what to compare or contrast his ideas with. And so in that regards, my naivete and my ignorance really just saved me. Imagine as, like, let's just say we talk about Buddhism, and you happen to have read or spent a few years, reading some books and talking a few things about that tradition. And as I'm talking, you begin to realize that there are gaps and holes, or just flaws in the way I'm expressing Buddhist ideas. And your knowledge and your experience becomes an obstacle. So as you're sitting there, you're basically very critical. So instead of feeling the ideas, you just think about the ideas, you criticize the ideas, especially my way of expression. And so you leave and vow to never come back. And so I think that was the major difference. The MTO, which is what the organization was and is huge now. And in fact, Emily has written her dissertation to some extent on that particular organization. The teacher, Nader, I guess the point is, when you have a huge number of following, you don't really get a chance to do one-on-one, or one-on-two or three or five. It's always a huge group where you're sitting on the stage and you're just talking, That's as far as I know. Hussein also had this personality where I think he worked with this man, his own teacher, for just a short while. And then he got married. And upon getting married, he just left that particular organization. He just wanted to kind of enjoy his marriage. For about 2-3 years, he didn't read. He didn't talk to anyone about any of these things. And then, like anything else, the honeymoon period, whether it's your relationship with a cup of coffee or just, with another human being, that kind of dimmed a little bit. And then, the idea of I remember who I was, or I remember who I am, or I remember who I want to be. After the excitement of marriage and the ceremony kind of dimmed a little, he remembered his original goal, which was to kind of figure out what the meaning of his life is. And coming to realize that that particular man helped him. he decided to move. And the guy who had taken over, who was his son, had kind of promised Hussein that he'd be given a certain station, he'd be given a certain position in the organization. But Hussein wasn't really about those things. Hussein came here for one reason, which was, I suppose, truth, whatever that may mean. Yeah, he wasn't the sort of personality that would talk about other people. You know, he wanted to be at the front and center. That's who and what he was. Even on occasion when we had Haqi around, he was also another interesting, person who had all these degrees. He was an MD, PhD, acupuncturist. He had his own teacher in Canada, and the teacher was, I think, 20 years younger than he was. Haqi was 50-some, and that kid in Canada was, I don't know, 25, 26, maybe younger. And according to Haqi, he had, like miraculous powers. But all those things aside, on few occasions, Haqi and Hussein would clash. Haqi had a very passive personality, where he was so well read, Haqi was, that he could make God and the devil friends, and he would walk with both of them. That wasn't the way Hussein was. Hussein was very black and white. And so, even though Hussein was very, very, very generous in inviting various people to the Persian Center, to give talks about Sufism, about poetry, about Hafiz, at the same time, if anyone, I think, gained some popularity, then I think you could see hints of jealousy and resentment. Well, going back to your question, Hussein didn't say much. But there is something about his teacher's face. When I joined the organization for no more than maybe 5-6 months, we had to buy books, and it was Hussein's teacher's books. Just this utter exhaustion you could see on his face, and it was because he didn't sleep very much. He was always fasting and meditating and those things. Not a very attractive man, but both Hussein and Shadia, because Shadia was a sculptor, and so she made busts of, this man. She also painted him. So there was a good amount of devotion towards Shah Maqsood. The other thing was that we were really never curious. Hussein was sufficient for us. If you like Irina Tweedy, there's a good chance you're not going to ask too much about Bhai Sahib. If, on the other hand, Bhai Sahib holds the magic, Irina becomes a conduit, so that every 10 minutes you ask Irina about Bhai Sahib, not so much about herself. Yeah, and I think Hussein had such a bad experience with the organization when he came here that he disliked any cults, any organizations, any big groups of people. And when our group kind of just fell apart, we all went our own different ways. On many occasions, Hussein would say that, with what I know now, I would have never gathered with the three of you. And I think it mostly spoke about, when you transition from one stage to another. You're single, then you get married, then you become pregnant, then you have a child, and you have a family life, then your kids leave. And so these are all stages that you go through. And I think it was like that for Hussein as well. There are really so many moving parts. I haven't really given it a good amount of time. When I started teaching, I would never tell students that I had washed cars for about 20 years. I never mentioned to them that I worked graveyard, El Paso Heights Shell gas station, or was a maid in Davis, or delivered newspaper. I think you kind of get yourself to a position in life where such things you feel are beneath you and they are a source of embarrassment. Then, it's no different than someone going to an AA center and standing up and saying, "My name is Amir Sabzavari and I'm an alcoholic." And for the first time you realize you're owning many years of story that you lived through. And it's not really a source of shame, but rather for the first time you have the courage to actually coming out and saying, "This is who I am and this has been my life." And so, because all you do in the classroom is just talk about these huge ideas, and when you talk about huge ideas, you hide behind Socrates and Plato and Kant and Hume. And a car wash and working at El Paso Heights, they have no room, they have no place in these ideas. The time passes, and you really begin to appreciate some of the places you've been in life. You also begin to look at all the things you have done in a different way. You do really become very proud of being an immigrant, in the sense that, especially for us in the 1970s and 80s, because every single one of us had to work so hard to make $1. We had to do just crazy things just to survive. And so when you kind of walk into the classroom and students look at you, the assumption is, well, this guy or this person has some degrees and they're here running off their mouth as if it means anything. And then it takes you a while to kind of say, it was actually a nice thing to work graveyard, and it was a nice thing to wash cars, because it's something my brother and I talk about all the time, which is, those 20 years of working next to my father and my mom. Our relationship is so solid. It just got us so close. But past that, I would never talk about Hussein. And then time passes. And then you kind of once in a while sit back and look at your life. And then you say, well, if that particular component wasn't there, or this particular component wasn't there, how would your life turn out? And then you say, oh, okay, well, I am, in this particular place in life because of what someone did for me like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And, it becomes, I think it serves a couple of purposes. First, it's a way you kind of appreciate what someone like Hussein or someone like my father did for us. But I couldn't say that to Hussein while he was alive, because I hadn't reached the maturity. I may have spoken finely in the classroom, but insofar as understanding, that was something very, very different. It's only now that I can kind of just look at you guys and say, you are here because of Hussein, not so much me. If he hadn't created the foundation, if he hadn't created the passion, it would have never been inside me. And so all of us are benefactors of what he did some years ago. And it's one of the ways that I suppose I could express my gratitude. The other aspect of it has to do with the fact that you and I live in a culture where doing it alone is something that's coveted. In fact, it is part of this culture, that if there is something you want to do out there, if you want to go on a spiritual quest of sorts, you can read books and you can go to sweat lodges and you can find teachers and this and that. And the truth is, that's not the way it works. And Hussein becomes a reference point for that. And because Hussein is part of a tradition, that tradition becomes a reference point for anyone who wants to learn any craft that is of some value, that there are some just rituals and traditions and steps you have to go through. It doesn't matter if it's piano or you want to become like the Buddha, or just, and these are just steps that you have to go through. And I think it's a way to also tell students that just in case you're interested in becoming good or proficient in any craft, there are these steps that you have to take, you know. And then you can give some live examples from my own experience. And it's not a piece of advertisement where you're telling them to follow you. You're just saying that if you want to be good, find someone who's been there and who's done that. You know, they just have to be a little bit better than you, a little bit ahead of you, so that, you know, they have seen the pitfalls a little bit, what's coming to you. But, you know, digression aside, going back to your question, you know, sometimes I watch these YouTubes, whether it's Eckhart Tolle or Sadhguru or any of those people, and they speak as if the way they just express ideas, and just the way they are. You know, people have lives. You know, people have disagreements with their companion. People hate their jobs. I think it's good to be in life, understand life, and also once in a while exit life and go into seclusion. And so when someone asks you a question, you can give them kind of the whole picture to some extent. And I think it takes a while to embrace all of that, because when you're in the classroom, you're all about ideas. And when someone asks you, what do I do with my marriage, for example, you say, well, let me tell you what Seneca said. You know what the Stoics said. Or when someone asks, well, how should I raise my kids? We said, well, let me tell you what, you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said in Emile, or what Rudolf Steiner said, you know, in his version of the Waldorf School. You know, so you kind of just hide behind these ideas, and they're great. These ideas are wonderful. And then you get slapped around or pushed around by life a little bit. And you realize, you know, nobody can live by the ideas given through books. It's stupid. You won't survive that way. You know, you really have to be cunning, and you have to be a really good politician, and you have to be clever and reflective, and you have to be mean, you know. You can't always, like these gurus, have this like stupid grin on your face and say, well, life is really wonderful if you just change your perspective. It doesn't work that way. Life is not that beautiful, you know. So, but, you know, it really does take a while. It does take a while to embrace both sides of life. And it certainly took me a while. You know, Abi, yesterday or the day before, brought this book, Mr. God, This Is Anna. It's a book that David Long had required for one of his classes. And it reminded me of this other book by Finn, Anna and Mr. Knight, her relationship with this mathematician. And this, you know, 7-year-old girl and this 50-year-old man just fight all the time. They have disagreements about, you know, various things. And he wants to keep his garden clean and organized, and she keeps punishing him, the 7-year-old. So why he doesn't allow life to just prosper? Why does he want to like cage life and mess with life? Just let life grow the way it wants to. And so they fight and fight and fight, and I think this old man gets sick, or maybe has a stroke. And then Anna goes to pay him a visit, and he looks at her and says, now I understand all the things you told me about, you know, just allowing life to be without, you know, trying to overpower it and organize it in a way that is just not good for life. But he had to go through certain experiences to ultimately understand what this 7-year-old is talking about. You know, when you are young and you lack the experience in anything, you create this huge fantasy about the craft that you want to be good at. And so you begin to abstain from certain things. You know, laughing becomes a sin, partying becomes a sin. I'm not talking like the stupid, I mean some of the foolish things that people do when they like go to parties, or they, I'm talking when when you want to really have a belly laugh, you have a belly laugh with Hussein. You know, you just don't hang out with anybody and just to laugh. You know, that'd be stupid, but it was for us. So I think with the right people, it's permissible to do all sorts of things. You know, it's only with the inappropriate people, with the people who don't belong in your circle, that just giving yourself the green light would be wrong. And so it really does take a while for you to get to a place where everything is just a nice buffet and everybody can kind of eat or drink from it. But it is tough. It takes a long time to get there. You know, sometimes you can't express you just can't express how beautiful something is unless you use the F word. You know, but when you're young and you read the Bible all the time, or you want to like become one of those like Sufis, you say, no, I don't want my tongue to be contaminated by filth. So you refrain from, which is not a bad thing, it's a great thing. Then you realize after a while that your usage of the F word is very much like a prayer. You know, but those who are not familiar, those who are strangers to your life, to your struggles, to your accomplishments, where you have been and what you have done and what you have accomplished, what they don't realize is that F for you is sacred. For them, you know, it's foul, it's blasphemous. So there will come a point, you know, where you really want to kind of keep yourself baptized in all sorts of ways. Then you get to a different stage in life where you realize your baptism is done through getting yourself all muddied up. And then you walk into the classroom and say, yes, yesterday I was baptized by mud, you know, and poop and this and that. And students may get a laugh, but I think for those who have, you know, the capacity to hear, they kind of listen because of the way you are, the way you say things, and they take notice. You know, I had pride myself in going to school and getting these degrees and reading all these books. Then I realized I'm not even 1/16 of what my father is. You know, he has 6th grade education. And he's a really, really, really decent man. He's a really good man. You know, he's a saint without ever wanting to become a saint. He really is, you know. But it took me a long time to realize that. So now when, you know, I talk to my father, I just joke around with him because, you know, I can't talk about old age because he's 30 years older than I am. You know, I can't talk about relationships because he's been married for 60 years. I can't talk about raising kids because he's raised 3 of them. You know, so everything that I want to talk about, I realize he can very easily checkmate me in a very nice way. So, you know, as an act of humility, I don't say much, you know, but initially when I was, you know, reading all these books and hanging out with Hussein, I looked at them and didn't see much. Then time passes and you realize, you know, it's really difficult for a 50-year-old man to leave his parents. That's a huge sacrifice. And you don't make sacrifices if you don't care. And you don't make sacrifices if you don't worry, you know. And these are wonderful elements, qualities to have inside you. That you worry about someone else and you hold them at a place where you see them more valuable than you, so you're willing to make the sacrifices. You know, it's not that all parents do, but in Islam there's a saying that some people don't get anything until their last breath. Then everything becomes clear to them and then they die. And some understand, you know, things a bit better, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes before their death. So When I was younger and consumed with these ideas in all the wrong ways, I was very close to getting married to someone who had MS. And I had imagined that I have the patience of Job, that eventually, because of my lifestyle, I will have miraculous powers and I will have the power to heal and all those things. Of course, the relationship didn't work out, but it took me, I think, 20, 25 years to realize that, relationships are like buying a car. They have nothing to do with Plato, they have nothing to do with God, they have nothing to do with Sufism. None of those things really matter. The question is, do you want to be stranded on the highway? And if so, how often? You begin to understand love and emotions and, some of the sacrifices that you have to make. And then the question is, once you have a good amount of understanding, do you want to do it? And if you understand something really, really well, the sacrifice becomes a bit easier. You still do it with a great amount of grunt, resentment, but it becomes a bit easier because it was your choice. If on the other hand you created a stupid story about yourself, about your life, then once life slaps you, then, you'll be really hurt. And you'll be very angry, often. I guess the point of all this ranting really is, it takes time to understand, it takes time to kind of accept the various places you've been in life. You kind of just open yourself up and you say, I've also been through A, B, C, D. You're not alone. And you can kind of just give it some philosophical, religious twist to make it a bit more spicy. But you shouldn't do it if you're not ready. And when you're ready, it just happens. There is no reason to push.